Getting ready for Halloween. You're watching Fridays at Home only on HGTV. Up next, Historic Homes of Salem, an all-new original special.
Salem, Massachusetts. Founded by Puritans, haunted by witch trials, made rich by shipping and trade. From English-style cottages to charming farmhouses to noble mansions, the fortunes and misfortunes of this intriguing city are told by the historic homes of Salem. Welcome to Historic Homes of Salem. I'm Tia Marlier. Salem, Massachusetts is shrouded in history and mystery. The city is probably best known for its 17th century witch trials. But in its time, it was also one of the most important seaports in the world. It began with the first Puritan settlers. Some of the homes built by Salem's earliest residents still stand. And in one, we see the foundation of a fascinating city. The year was 1626. Golden sunlight spread over the Atlantic Ocean and across the rocky Massachusetts coastline. The first to come were small groups of Englishmen who fished for cod in the rich coastal waters. But it would be the Puritans who landed a few years later in 1629 who would leave an indelible mark on Massachusetts and America. In search of religious freedom, the Puritans named their settlement Salem after the Hebrew word for peace.
The very first years were tough. That's true for any colony. When it's your job to tame the wilderness from the coast back, that's a hard job.
The Puritan settlers built what they knew, small timber-framed cottages that mirrored the buildings of their English homeland. Out of the wilds of Massachusetts, the Puritans carved out new lives. By the 1680s, Salem had been transformed from a fledgling colony to a flourishing port, a place where craftsmen and laborers, like leather tanner John Ward, were able to own a home. Like most of the early homes in Salem, John Ward's house was built in 1684 in the first period style. These first period style homes were late medieval structures, simple and box-like, with steep pitched roofs and imposing gables.
Something like the Ward House, which to many people looks like, oh no, they lived in that house. Yikes. That was actually a very comfortable middle-class artisan's house.
As a leather craftsman, John Ward did well with his trade, and as such, he and his family lived in relative comfort. Like most craftsmen's homes in Salem, the Wards had the comfort of small glass windows, an expensive commodity in 17th century America. The glass had to be shipped from England. The casement panes were shaped into smaller diamonds, making them easier to replace if broken. A central chimney divided the house. Sturdy pine and white ash beams supported the walls and second floor.
The one feature that I find extraordinary about it is just the size of the building members that were used, the great lintels and post and beam construction, far more massive than it needed to be. But to me, it reflects the kind of medieval mentality of protection and fortress-like life that people lived back at that time.
It may have looked like a fortress, but for John Ward, his wife, and his 7 children, it was a home. Living here, though, meant crowded conditions and little privacy. The main room, with its simple furniture, served as both a parlor and bedroom.
You see these beds, and they talk about how many people would sleep in the beds together, to stay warm, and it's really a very, very rustic lifestyle.
As in many first period style houses, the centerpiece of John Ward's house was the kitchen. The fireplace was wide, and a locally made table and bench provided a place to eat, or perhaps more importantly, to retreat from the cold. The Wards cooked on a roasting jack, a spit-like device that turned meat in the fire as it cooked.
And would have been a luxury item at the time because it would have been a fairly expensive thing. But I think the kitchen certainly reflects how laborious it was to prepare food at the time, but also that they were interested in labor-saving devices the same way people are today.
Despite these luxuries, surviving every day was a struggle for working-class residents like John Ward.
The people were tough. The people were very intelligent, they were very disciplined, they were willing to work, they were very society-oriented. The society was much more important than the individual. And I think a combination of factors really made this, this community work.
But by the 1690s, things in Salem started to turn. The town named for peace was becoming a breeding ground of mistrust. A dark cloud was passing over the seemingly tranquil settlement of Salem. And with that came apprehension, uncertainty, and fear. When we return, mistrust shades the town of Salem as the fury of witch trials knocks on the door of one of the accused. The Rebecca Nurse House, when the historic homes of Salem continues. Welcome back to Historic Homes of Salem. I'm Tia Marlier. Over the past 300 years, the town of Salem, Massachusetts has been colored by its Puritan roots, exotic Far East trade, and its magnificent architecture. But it is still probably best known for its dark and captivating witchcraft trials. The trials of 1692 and the Salem witch hunts have branded this fascinating city for several centuries. The home of one brave woman, Rebecca Nurse, stands as a reminder that out of an ordinary life came an extraordinary person, a woman whose integrity is still felt today. In the early 1600s, the rich smell of tilled earth filled the air at the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Here, at this red-painted homestead in Salem Village, an elderly woman worked in her herb garden, collecting fragrant thyme and comfrey. This 300-acre farm was the home of Rebecca Nurse and her husband Francis, a typical hard-working Puritan couple. Devoted to their homestead, Rebecca and her husband Francis leased the homestead, but dreamed of one day owning it.
One of the things that settlers to the New World wanted to do was become independent. And although Rebecca came over here as a child with her parents, she married well, and they were able to find a very good and large homestead where they could prosper. And I'm sure in 1692, at 71 years old, Rebecca was very content with her life.
The Nurse homestead was a solid first-period home built in 1678. The saltbox exterior resembled most 17th century Massachusetts farmhouses, with its steep pitched roof and post and beam construction. Built tight as a ship, the interior, too, reflected the typical lifestyle of a hard-working family in Salem.
When Rebecca and her family lived here, there were probably only 2 rooms in the house. the Great Hall, a throwback to medieval times, in which you would really have the most activities happening in the household here.
The nurse's 8 children slept upstairs in the other room, a bedroom called the hall chamber. Rebecca's days were filled with the chores of an average woman of her time. The kitchen section of the Great Hall was primarily Rebecca's domain, where she cooked and dried herbs. At night, the main part of the Great Hall was transformed into sleeping quarters for Rebecca and her husband. Their rope bed had a hinge to push it out of the way to make space during the day. It was a simple life for this large family and their devoted mother, Rebecca.
I'm sure she thought of the future as being a contented lot in which she would eventually die, and her homestead would continue on with the family, and she would always be remembered as a good and great mother and grandmother and great-grandmother.
But nothing could have prepared this elderly woman for what would happen in Salem in March of 1692. It all began with a group of teenage girls claiming to be afflicted. One girl was unable to speak. Others said they had visions. Some spoke in tongues. For many of the Puritans in Salem, there was only one explanation.
And all of a sudden, on one day, you've got this small group of girls who try witchcraft. And whether it was or it wasn't, the Puritans in the area are very willing to believe that. If we allowed witchcraft, well then that would put us out of favor with God. And if that put us out of favor with God, then we'd better take care of that.
What followed was utter hysteria. On March 19, 1692, fingers pointed to 71-year-old Rebecca Nurse, accusing her of witchcraft. A charge Rebecca adamantly denied.
She said, "As to these things, I'm as innocent as the child unborn."
A warrant was issued, and a constable was sent to the homestead to arrest Rebecca. She followed the constable's orders without alarm and left the homestead peaceably.
When she left the homestead, I don't think she had any idea that this was probably the last time in her life that she would ever see her home.
But it would be. For 3 long months, Rebecca was held in jail. By June, she was taken to a courthouse for trial.
Unlike the others who were found guilty, Rebecca initially was found innocent. And the jury came back with a not guilty finding. And when that happened in court in Salem, the afflicted girls who were present went into terrible fits.
The jury was called back in, and Rebecca's case was reviewed.
They gave Rebecca a chance to try to refute the evidence, and apparently because there was so much pandemonium going on, she just kind of stood there, which to the jury seemed like an admission of guilt, and they came back with a guilty finding. She was hanged on July 19th.
Never doubting Rebecca's character, the family brought her body back to the homestead and laid her to rest. Undaunted, the Nurse family continued to live in the farmhouse till 1784. Almost 100 years past the witchcraft trials, the family continued to believe in Rebecca. Today, the Nurse homestead remains a symbol of one woman's strength, of her dream for a better life in the new world, and of her devotion to the truth.
She remained faithful to herself and to her religion, and was willing to sacrifice her own self for the principle of truth. And to me, that's always really the remarkable thing that shines from the witchcraft hysteria, is that average people, when confronted with the worst crisis in their life, were able to rise above it and become basically heroic. And I think that's a good lesson for us to think about and remember today.
Still to come, with a view of the sea and a vision of the Orient, one Salem merchant changed the world, the home of one of America's first millionaires. When the Historic Homes of Salem returns. Welcome back to Historic Homes of Salem. By the 1700s, Salem, Massachusetts had left its haunting history behind. Shipping transformed Salem into one of the most important seaports in the world. And a man who would become one of America's first millionaires moved into a house overlooking the Salem waterfront. The vast Atlantic Ocean had carried Puritans to American shores in search of religious freedom. But it wasn't long before the people of Salem were setting sail again, this time in search of riches. By the early 1700s, the shipping industry filled the pockets of Salem with gold and lined its streets with magnificent mansions. At this house, overlooking a wharf, lived Salem's most prominent merchant. Elias Haskett Derby ruled a shipping empire that made Salem world famous and made Derby one of the wealthiest Americans of all time.
Derby opened up a lot of ports on his own. He'd send vessels to China, to Russia, to places like the Philippines, to places like India, places like Arabia. You know, really anywhere in the world you could land a vessel. Derby was willing to send a ship there.
When Elias Derby moved into this house with his bride Elizabeth in 1762, he was still working his way to the top. Indeed, this future millionaire did not even own his own home. Derby's father built the house as a wedding gift, but retained its title. Still, it was more than respectable, standing 2.5 stories, with a gambrel roof and 3 dormer windows in the Georgian style. Solid brick resisted the cold winds of the Atlantic. While living in this house, Elias Derby began to build his empire. The interior reflected the tension between the Derbys' Puritan heritage and their growing wealth. The front hall was spare in a nod to Puritan austerity. But details, like hand-turned spindles and an end post in a complicated corkscrew pattern, spoke of great expense. In the parlor, the Derbys decorated with less reserve. A mahogany armchair was covered with silk damask. A Queen Anne table was surrounded with mahogany Chippendale chairs. A canvas floor cloth centered on a mariner's compass, a tribute to the trade that drove the fortunes of both Salem and this house. Shipping permeated this home like the salt air that blew in off the Atlantic. Derby's study was filled with the mementos his captains brought back from their journeys. Shells came from the Pacific Islands, porcelain from Dutch colonies in the East Indies. Derby could read many languages and kept an extensive library.
Derby is noted for having somewhere between 500 and 700 books, and he was very well read, which undoubtedly helped him to understand the world around him.
Understanding the world opened it to Elias Derby. He pushed his fleet to the ends of the earth and owned one of the first American ships to reach Canton, China. Luxuries like tea and pepper became common in American households thanks to Elias Derby and the ships of Salem.
There's an interesting story about a ship that sailed to the South Pacific. It was from Baltimore, and they said, "Where are you from?" "United States." And the natives said, "The United States, is that anywhere near Salem?" Derby was so important in Salem that he was known as King Derby.
During the 20 years that Elias Derby lived in this home, Salem was emerging as one of the richest cities in America. Derby himself was becoming perhaps the nation's first millionaire. And in 1782, he moved his family to an even more elaborate mansion, leaving his waterfront home behind.
I think this is the house where he first began. This is the house where he began his marriage. He began raising his family. He began his climb as a merchant. So this was the house he started in. He called this his little brick house.
This little brick house launched Derby's fortune and cast his nets into the rich bounty of the world. Just ahead, one of Salem's most innovative architects changes the look of the city. Masterpieces built along the streets of Salem. When the Historic Homes of Salem returns. Welcome back. I'm Tia Marlier. By 1790, Salem, Massachusetts had become one of the nation's most beautiful cities. Fueled by maritime success, ship captains, traders, and entrepreneurs were eager to express their new affluence. They did so by building themselves beautiful homes. The design of choice for these kings of shipping was the Federal style, and it placed Salem on the map of fine architecture. Federal-style homes line the streets of Salem, Massachusetts like proud sentinels. These square three-story houses are known for their symmetry and elegance. Simple and almost austere, Federal-style homes were pleasing to the eye with graceful porticos, long proportioned windows, and they gave Salem its architectural identity. The son of a builder, Samuel McIntyre is credited with designing some of the finest examples of Federal-style homes in Salem, if not all of America.
McIntyre had talents and abilities far beyond anyone else of his generation. He really rose to the occasion and started doing something that was quite unusual at the time, which was actually designing buildings on paper for clients.
In 1804, John Gardner, a successful Salem merchant, commissioned McIntyre to build him a Federal-style home. A home that would become a Salem showpiece. McIntyre's Federal-style house stood out with its blushing, apricot-colored brick. In keeping with the Federal style of building, a simple, refined balustrade hid the low-hipped roof. Corinthian pillars enhanced the portico, graced by intricate carving that would become McIntyre's trademark.
The whole sort of surface skin is very tight across the front, and the only real protrusion is this elegant portico, which draws your eye right to the doorway and right inside the house.
With symmetry typical of Federal-style homes, the first floor was made up of 4 main rooms. Decorative public rooms were on one side of the house, and private family rooms were on the other side. The most heavily used family space in Gardner's home was the dining room. Called the keeping room at the time, it was where the family ate, read, studied, and played. But it was the beautiful public rooms that expressed McIntyre's ingenuity. Gardner, an importer of Far Eastern textiles, could entertain and display his wealth in the double parlor. McIntyre put in pocket doors, which were novel in Salem, creating 2 parlors out of 1. But it was McIntyre's fine carving that set him apart as a builder. Classical designs were carved directly into mahogany furniture or mantels. Emblems of abundance, such as baskets of fruit and sheaves of wheat, reflected Gardner's and Salem's prosperity.
The carving's extraordinary. I mean, he really was considered the best carver of his day. And that is unique and a feature, again, that gives Salem architecture a great distinction when you compare it with other places.
But the crowning jewel inside the Gardner home was the main hallway. McIntyre designed it with a sweeping, elegant stair and delicate archway. Hallways during the late 18th century were usually used as discreet passageways, hidden from public view. But McIntyre's elegant center room stood on its own, bridging the public rooms to the private.
Even as you walk inside the house, this hallway was made to impress, to be drop-dead gorgeous. Every piece perfectly carved, perfectly detailed.
Refined, elegant Federal-style themes were symbols of Salem's rise to prominence. But by the 1830s, Salem's days of glamour were beginning to fade. Because of its small harbor, maritime trade was increasingly diverted to Boston's more ample bay. Gardner lost a number of ships, went bankrupt, and out of financial necessity, sold the home to a family named Pingree. While Salem's golden age of architecture didn't last long, McIntyre's grand Federal-style homes left a lasting impression.
Was one of those extraordinary times in history, and you can think of Venice and other places in the world where you had an infusion of wealth, but then you had talent and craftsmen here who were able to create many of these great architectural things. And certainly the Gardner Pingree House is probably the supreme expression of that.
Still ahead, the birthplace of Nathaniel Hawthorne, where a childhood home created the foundation for one of America's greatest authors. When the Historic Homes of Salem returns. Welcome back to Historic Homes of Salem. Salem, Massachusetts is not just known for its infamous witch trials. It was the birthplace of one of America's greatest authors. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote American classics like The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables. The cradle of his career and his life was a sea captain's house in Salem. In 1804, in a modest but respectable red clapboard house in Salem, a baby boy was born on the 4th of July. The child of a Salem sea captain and his wife, he was christened Nathaniel Hathorne, but as an adult, the world would know him as Nathaniel Hawthorne. One day, the boy who spent his earliest years in this house would be among those who would chart the course of American literature.
He's one of the icons. Hawthorne is crucial. He really did contribute a great deal to what's called the American Renaissance, or what one scholar has called the flowering of New England.
The cradle of this illustrious career was a simple home in Salem. The Hathornes were the second owners of the home.
It begins here. This is where it began. This is just a rather typical middle-class ship captain's house.
Also typical of the time, babies were born at home. Nathaniel Hawthorne came into the world in an upstairs bedroom of this house. It doubled as a workroom, and the movable bed, called a press bed, could be pushed against the wall to make room for a spinning wheel. While Nathaniel's parents were not rich, they were comfortable enough to outfit their home with some elegance. In the front parlor sat a delicate lantern clock from Ipswich, England, a typical piece found in many Salem homes. A room full of treasured pieces, this was no place for a little boy. While his mother ran the household, Nathaniel's father was often away at sea, sometimes for months at a time. In his absence, young Nathaniel could linger among his father's things in the upstairs study.
This back room, or the sea captain's parlor, as we call it, is something that links us and shows us the relationship that the Hathorns had to the sea.
To a young boy, the sea captain's parlor was a place of wonder. A richly toned mahogany desk spoke of his father's power. A telescope and mariner's sextant were the tools of his trade. But perhaps most important to young Nathaniel was the view. Looking out this window toward the Atlantic, Nathaniel would watch for his father's ship on the vast horizon. But when Nathaniel was just 4 years old, he learned his father would never return again. Captain Hathorn caught yellow fever and passed away at sea. Elizabeth Hathorn moved her family from this home, and the first chapter in the life of a great author came to a close. As an adult, Nathaniel would learn that his history was not only tied to the sea, but also to Salem's dark past. Nathaniel learned that his own ancestor had been a judge at the infamous witch trials. Seeking to shed the shame of this heritage, Nathaniel Hathorn changed his name to Hawthorne.
He didn't want anybody to think he was part of this, so he slipped a W in his name and became a flowering tree rather than the descendant of a witchcraft judge, and he became Hawthorne. Man, clever move on his part.
Nathaniel later left Salem, but Salem never left him. It influenced virtually everything he wrote, and it continued to draw him home to the land of his ancestors and the place of his birth.
This is home. This was definitely home. Even though he had that sort of looming over him, it also was where he had been brought up. It's where all of his family history was, and I think he was really tied to this place.
Introspective and brilliant, Nathaniel Hawthorne reflected the very city he was born in. His own tale began with his childhood home. The modest clapboard house stands as a reminder of the gifted writer's first view of life. Still to come, a home that raised Puritan eyebrows and piqued Nathaniel Hawthorne's curiosity. Mysteries hidden at the House of the Seven Gables. When Historic Homes of Salem returns.
Welcome back. I'm Tia Marlier. Of all the historic homes in Salem, Massachusetts, there is one that most embodies the town's maritime history, literary tradition, and striking architecture. It captured the imagination of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who made it famous in his novel, The House of the Seven Gables.
Tall, moody, and intriguing, this dark-paneled mansion has become an icon for Salem. In the first line of his literary classic, Nathaniel Hawthorne described it as a rusty wooden house with 7 acutely peaked gables.
In a lot of ways, this really has become one of the banners, one of the flags for Salem. This is a physical structure that has seen all that history that you can hammer a nail into and say, look, this has been there for this time, and it's seen all that.
This history began in 1668 when successful sea captain John Turner built the home overlooking Salem's bustling bay. Like many of Salem's early homes, Turner's house was built in the first period style, with its Tudor flavor, steeped pitched roof, and post and beam construction. As Captain Turner's wealth increased, he expanded the size of his home. Turner furnished his 20-room mansion with the finest pieces he could find in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Like a finely crafted highboy which adorned the great chamber. But the home's most distinctive features were the 7 wide gables. By the 1690s, Captain Turner's home was considered to be among Salem's finest. And it was extravagant enough to create a stir with Turner's Puritan neighbors.
People in Salem start to raise eyebrows, and that's very interesting because as the witch trials come around, you've got people who might even be thinking that John Turner might be doing something wrong because this excess is already a hint that he's maybe not the purest of Puritans.
The witchcraft hysteria left Turner unscathed. And for the next 100 years, the gabled home would stay in his family. In the late 1700s, the Turners sold the mansion to the Salem family of Susanna Ingersoll. It was a transaction that would significantly alter the course of American literature. For Susanna was related to an aspiring writer named Nathaniel Hawthorne. Susanna would often invite her favorite cousin into her home.
She's got this wonderful old home. Nathaniel is very interested in local history and uses that as a source for inspiration.
Susanna's stories and her home cast a powerful spell over Hawthorne, who visited frequently. As he wandered through the rooms of the mansion, soaking up the history of Salem, Hawthorne's imagination was set free. His favorite room was the parlor, where it is said Hawthorne would jot notes at a Hawthorne family desk, an 18th century heirloom treasure. But perhaps what intrigued Hawthorne most was tucked away just off the dining room. Hidden behind a door was a secret staircase that wound its way up through the center of the home to an upstairs bedroom. Many in Salem believed it was used to hide witches during the trials. For Hawthorne, the secret stairs symbolized his fascination with the home.
I think through the years he loved histories, he loved hearing about the families that had lived here, the things that had happened in this house, and I think it was a good catalyst for his imagination.
The 7 gables piqued Hawthorne's imagination too, with their pointed roofs and dark shadows.
One of the lures that we have is that on one of these visits to Susanna Ingersoll, as he's coming down from the attic, having heard the stories and looked at the house, he comes down the stairs and says, "The house has 7 gables, that sounds well."
Hawthorne's novel, The House of the 7 Gables, became a classic and helped lay the foundation of American literature. Telling the story of a family curse and the romance that cured it, Hawthorne used the gabled mansion as a central character.
I think there's 3 facets to this building: the literary connection, the wonderful document of early American architecture, and then also this standing reminder of this town's maritime history.
From the tips of its gables to the depths of its rich patinaed color, the House of the 7 Gables connects Salem to its rich past. Nathaniel Hawthorne and the mysteries within the gabled house are connected forever. The House of the 7 Gables was both Hawthorne's muse and his masterpiece, and inspired him to write an American classic. Still to come, a Salem family that lived in one house for more than 125 years. Unlocking the doors of this treasure chest and stepping inside the Ropes Mansion when the Historic Homes of Salem returns.
Welcome back. I'm Tia Marlier. Among the countless beautiful homes of Salem, Massachusetts, one stands out for its contents alone. The Ropes Mansion is a treasure trove of cherished objects, housing a world-famous collection of furniture and decorative arts, and 4 generations of family memories. The Ropes Mansion offers a glimpse into the history of one Salem family and America for over 300 years.
By the turn of the 20th century, Salem, Massachusetts was a city bejeweled with stately mansions, relics from prosperous days past. Built in 1727, the Ropes Mansion was one of those gems. With its handsome black shutters and noble Georgian exterior. But the Ropes Mansion was especially unique on the inside, where its treasures spanned generations. By 1900, the last Ropes to live in the mansion were 3 unmarried sisters. They adored their family home and recognized the value of its history.
So essentially what you have with this house is 125 years of association with the Ropes family. So you have this amazing document which helps you chart the life of a very interesting family in Salem.
It all began in 1768 with Judge Nathaniel Ropes II, a socially prominent English loyalist. The judge bought the large 1720s Georgian-style mansion for his growing family and his pressing social needs.
Now, the family moved here in the 1760s, just prior to the Revolutionary War, and that's when the story gets a little more interesting.
April 19, 1775. Early dawn in Lexington, Massachusetts. The American Revolution begins with the shot heard round the world. And across New England, American patriots were called to arms. Frail and in poor health, English loyalist Judge Ropes was in his sickbed as patriots approached his door.
It's quite well documented that local patriots were particularly incensed that he was retaining ownership of the house, that he was a prominent loyalist, and there are accounts of the door being sort of bashed and the house being attacked by a mob.
Despite the angry threats, the Ropes Mansion and the judge were spared. After the Revolutionary War, the home remained in the family's hands. Continuing to treat the house with loving care, the Ropes family decorated the home with finely crafted furniture. The front parlor showcased the Ropes' luxurious mahogany-carved red velvet settee, which was used during formal parties. The 1833 pianoforte was a birthday gift for one of the Ropes' children. The back parlor featured 8 fancy-painted dining chairs, which were made in Salem, home to some of the most exquisite furniture of the early 1800s.
It was very classic, it was well-proportioned, well-detailed, but not overdone. It's something that was very strong of character and well-developed, but not overly fussy.
In 1893, 3 unmarried Ropes sisters, Sarah, Eliza, and Mary, inherited the mansion. Because the Ropes sisters had no heirs of their own to inherit the mansion, they began preparing the home as a gift for the city. The affluent sisters also attached an endowment to the house to ensure its care. At the turn of the century, the sisters donated the house to the Essex Institute. Today, the Peabody Essex Museum continues to preserve and maintain the mansion for all of Salem. The Ropes family mansion is a time capsule of Salem's past.
The story of Salem, Massachusetts is as deep as the ocean that meets it. Intriguing, vast, and complex. It's a city with an unforgettable blend of history and tradition that comes together in the historic homes of Salem. I'm Tia Marlier. Thank you for joining us.
Tour the homes of 4 big-time magicians and discover what kinds of design secrets they have up their sleeves on Magical Homes. Coming up next on HGTV.